At 10:25 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, a young United States Navy lieutenant named Richard Best pulled back on the control stick of his Dauntless dive bomber and rolled into a vertical dive from 14,000 feet. Below him lay the aircraft carrier Akagi, the Japanese flagship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Best carried one bomb, a single 1,000-pound bomb. In the next 6 minutes, that bomb and the bombs of his fellow pilots would sink 4 Japanese fleet carriers, kill 3,057 Japanese sailors, and end forever the Empire of Japan's dream of dominating the Pacific Ocean. But the real story of Midway is not the story of how America won. The real story is how the admirals of the Imperial Japanese Navy realized, too late, that they had sailed into a trap of their own making. And it began with a single catapult, jammed at 4:30 in the morning. The message arrived at 7:28 in the morning, June 4th, 1942. A single line of Morse code, transmitted from a floatplane bouncing on turbulent air 200 nautical miles northeast of Midway Atoll. The plane was Scout Number 4, launched from the heavy cruiser Tone. It should have been airborne 30 minutes earlier. But Tone's catapult had jammed, and by the time the mechanics beat it back into working order, the aircraft was late. 30 minutes. In the calculus of naval warfare, 30 minutes is nothing. 30 minutes is a coffee break. 30 minutes is the time it takes to finish a briefing. 30 minutes was also the exact amount of time it took to change the outcome of the war in the Pacific. The message read, 10 enemy surface ships sighted, course southeast, speed 20 knots, bearing 010 degrees from Midway. Distance 240 miles. The radio operator on the flagship carrier Akagi transcribed it and passed it up the chain of command. It reached the bridge in less than a minute. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, 55 years old, commander of the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled, read the paper without expression. He was a torpedo specialist by training, a methodical man, a cautious man, the kind of officer who preferred certainty over glory. He looked at the message, looked at the sea, and said nothing then. 8 minutes later, at 8:20 in the morning, the second message came. This one was shorter. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo did not move. His staff officers did not speak. Somewhere below the bridge, in the vast steel hangars of Akagi, ammunition handlers were sweating through their uniforms, unbolting torpedoes from 93 reserve aircraft, replacing them with land attack bombs, because the intelligence briefings had been absolutely clear. The nearest American carriers were still at Pearl Harbor, nearly 1,000 miles away. There could not be an American carrier here. It was impossible. It was doctrine. It was fact. And yet, to understand how Chuichi Nagumo arrived at that moment on the bridge of Akagi, staring at a message that should not have existed, you have to go back 6 months. You have to go back to another morning, another attack, another moment when the Imperial Japanese Navy believed it had won a decisive victory. Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. Nagumo commanded the same strike force, the same 4 carriers, the same pilots. In 110 minutes of coordinated air assault, they sank or crippled 8 American battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed over 2,400 Americans. The Pacific Fleet was gutted. Tokyo celebrated. The Japanese public was told the war was already won, but Isoroku Yamamoto did not celebrate. Yamamoto was 58 years old that summer. He was commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. He was, by nearly universal agreement, the finest naval mind in Japan. He was also, quietly, the man who understood better than anyone that Japan was living on borrowed time. In 1910, when he was still a young lieutenant commander, the Navy had sent him to the United States. He had studied at Harvard. He had crossed America by train. He had seen the oil fields of Texas, the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of the Chesapeake. In 1926, He had returned as naval attaché in Washington. He had walked the streets of American cities. He had eaten in American diners. He had played poker with American officers, and he had won consistently because he was a man who understood odds. He knew the odds against Japan. He had said it openly before the war: if we must fight, I will run wild for 6 months or a year. After that, I have no expectation of success. He had opposed the war with America. He had lost that argument. And then, once the decision was made, he had done what a professional officer does. He had designed the war he had opposed. He had built the trap that struck Pearl Harbor. He had planned the operations that swept across the Pacific in the first 90 days of 1942. Wake Island, the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies. Every battle a Japanese victory, every battle exactly the kind of quick, decisive strike he had promised he could deliver. But he knew that Pearl Harbor had missed the American carriers. He knew that the strike had accomplished exactly nothing against the industrial base that mattered. He knew that every month the war lasted, American shipyards were laying keels for new carriers, new battleships, new cruisers. He knew the numbers. In 1941, Japan produced nearly 7 million tons of steel. The United States produced 83 million. The disparity in aviation fuel production was worse. The disparity in trained pilots was worse still. Yamamoto had spent years inside the American economy. He had seen its scale, and he knew that if this war was not won in the first year, it could not be won at all. And so, in the spring of 1942, he did something that his own staff considered reckless. He designed Operation MI. The Midway operation. The trap that was supposed to end the war. Here is the first strange thing about the story of Midway. The man who designed the trap was the one man in the Imperial Japanese Navy who understood best why traps of this size are never a good idea. The man who had studied at Harvard, who had walked the streets of Washington, who had seen the American factories firsthand, was the man who committed Japan to a nearly 200-ship operations spread across thousands of miles of ocean, with 5 separate task forces, timed to converge on a coral atoll 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto knew better, and Yamamoto did it anyway, because he was out of time. The operation was designed to lure the surviving American carriers into a decisive engagement. Midway itself was bait. The atoll was strategically useful, but the real target was the 3 remaining American fleet carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. If Japan could sink those 3 ships, the Pacific would belong to the Imperial Navy for at least a year. Long enough, perhaps, to negotiate a peace on Japanese terms. The plan required surprise. It required perfect coordination between forces separated by more than 1,000 miles of open water. It required the Americans to react exactly as Japanese intelligence predicted they would react. It required the enemy to be blind and slow and demoralized. And it required Nagumo's 4 carriers, striking as one unified fist, to catch the American fleet at the moment of maximum vulnerability. There was only one problem. 2 of the most important men on those carriers were not going to be at their posts. Commander Minoru Genda was 37 years old. He was, without exaggeration, the finest tactical mind in Japanese naval aviation. He had planned the air component of Pearl Harbor. He had designed the doctrine of concentrated carrier strikes that had made the Kido Butai the terror of the Pacific. If anyone on Akagi could think clearly under pressure, it was Genda. If anyone could look at a confusing situation and see the correct move within seconds, it was Genda. But 3 days before the battle, Genda had collapsed with pneumonia. He lay in his cabin on Akagi, feverish, coughing, drifting in and out of consciousness. When the scout plane's message arrived on the bridge, Genda was not there. He could not be there. His lungs were burning. He could barely stand. The staff officers made decisions without him. The man who had built the doctrine could not be present to apply it. He was not the only one. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida was 39 years old. He was the flight leader who had led the strike on Pearl Harbor. He was the pilot who had transmitted the immortal signal, Tora, Tora, Tora. He was the man whose voice had launched the war. If anyone in the strike force understood the tempo of carrier air combat, it was Fuchida. On June 3rd, he was scheduled to lead the initial attack on Midway. He never made it to the cockpit. On the 2nd of June, Fuchida had been hospitalized aboard Akagi for an emergency appendectomy. He was recovering in his cabin, unable to fly, unable to fight, able only to watch. When the battle came, he would be carried up to the bridge on a stretcher. He would witness what happened next through the fog of anesthesia and post-surgical pain. Two men, two indispensable men, both sidelined by illness at the exact moment their expertise was most needed. The kind of coincidence that later, in retrospect, seems almost too neat to be true, but there it was. The finest tactical co-mind and the finest strike leader in the Imperial Japanese Navy, both taken out of the game by ordinary human biology. Not enemy fire, not sabotage, just infection and inflammation and the ordinary treachery of the body. The men who would replace them were competent officers. Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, 49 years old, was Nagumo's chief of staff. He was a solid administrator, a careful thinker, and the kind of man who almost always advised the cautious option. Which was fine, if the situation called for caution. But there is a difference between an officer who chooses caution and an officer who understands both caution and aggression well enough to know which the moment demands. Kusaka was the former, Genda was the latter, and in the coming battle, the difference would matter. Meanwhile, 6,000 kilometers to the east, in a windowless basement office beneath the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, another man was preparing for the battle in a very different way. Commander Joseph Rochefort was 42 years old. He was the officer in charge of Station Hypo, the American Naval Cryptanalysis Unit in Hawaii. He worked in what his own team called the Dungeon. It was a converted storage space in a basement. It smelled of stale coffee, mimeograph ink, and the sweat of 30 men who had not slept properly in months. There were no windows. The lighting was fluorescent. The floor was concrete. Rochefort worked in slippers. He wore a red smoking jacket over his uniform because the basement was cold, and he was constantly moving between stations, checking work, comparing decrypts. He slept perhaps 4 hours a night on a cot in the corner of the office. He ate when someone put food in front of him. He had one job, read the Japanese Navy's mail, and in the spring of 1942, against every expectation of Japanese naval security, he was doing it. The Japanese Naval Code was designated JN-25. It was a super-enciphered code, meaning it used a codebook to convert words to 5-digit numerical groups and then applied a second layer of numerical additives to disguise the groups further. In theory, it was unbreakable without both the codebook and the additive tables, neither of which the Americans possessed. But codes are broken not by possession. They are broken by pattern. Rochefort and his team, a small group of officers, linguists, punch card operators, and civilian mathematicians, had been working on JN-25 for months. They had partial breaks. They had recovered fragments of the codebook by cross-referencing, intercepted messages against known events. They had guessed at the additive patterns by looking at the statistical distribution of digit groups. By May of 1942, they could read about 15% of an average JN-25 message on first pass. With enough context, they could sometimes read 40%. It was not perfect, it was not clean, but it was enough. They noticed something in April, a term appearing repeatedly in intercepted traffic. A two-letter geographical designator, AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway. Washington disagreed. The intelligence establishment in Washington believed the Japanese were preparing to attack somewhere else. The Aleutians, Fiji, even the west coast of the United States. There were serious flag officers in Washington. who believed Rochefort was mistaken. He was young. He was eccentric. He worked in a basement. He wore slippers to work. What did he know? Rochefort proposed a test. He suggested that Midway Atoll transmit an uncoded radio message, in plain English, announcing that its freshwater distillation plant had broken down. The message was sent. The atoll broadcast, in the clear, that it was running short of drinking water. Within 48 hours, Station Hippo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF was experiencing water supply problems. That report was radioed to Tokyo. It was radioed to Yamamoto's staff on the battleship Yamato. It was radioed to Nagumo's strike force at sea. Rochefort read it and smiled. AF was Midway. The information reached Admiral Chester Nimitz on the 17th of May. Nimitz was 57 years old. Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, a Texan, calm, patient, willing to trust his intelligence officers when the intelligence was good. He looked at the intercepts. He looked at Rochefort's estimates. He believed them completely, and he began to plan. Nimitz knew the target. He knew the approximate date, the 4th of June. He knew the composition of the Japanese force. He knew which task groups would approach from which direction. He knew the diversionary strike planned against the Aleutian Islands. He knew, in effect, the entire operational plan of the Japanese combined fleet. He knew it because Yamamoto's own signal traffic had told him. And now Nimitz had to decide what to do with this knowledge. He had 2 operational carriers immediately available, Enterprise and Hornet, both under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, both freshly returned from the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. That was 2 carriers. Yamamoto was bringing 4. Nimitz needed a 3rd carrier. Yorktown had been at Coral Sea in early May. She had taken serious damage. A Japanese bomb had penetrated her flight deck and detonated below, gutting internal compartments, cracking structural frames, killing 66 of her crew. Naval engineers who examined her at Pearl Harbor on the 27th of May estimated that repairs would take 3 months. Nimitz gave them 72 hours. What happened next has entered American naval mythology, but the mythology understates the reality. 1,400 shipyard workers descended on Yorktown. They worked in shifts around the clock. They welded steel plate over the ruined compartments. They braced the cracked frames from blow with timber. They rewired electrical systems. They did not repair the damage, they patched it. They made the ship capable of steaming and fighting and left the real repairs for later. Because there might not be a later if Yorktown was not at Midway on the 4th of June. On the 30th of May, 72 hours after entering dry dock, Yorktown put to sea. Welders were still working on her deck as she cleared the harbor. Her air group had been assembled from 3 different squadrons in barely more than a day. Half her crew did not know each other's names. She sailed anyway. Nimitz placed all 3 of his carriers at a position roughly 300 miles northeast of Midway. On the American charts, the location was labeled Point Luck. It was not, in fact, luck. It was calculation. Nimitz had chosen Point Luck because it was outside the arc of Japanese aerial reconnaissance. Japanese scout planes would sweep the seas to the east and southeast of Midway, expecting American forces to come racing up from Pearl Harbor. They would not sweep the northeast, because Japanese doctrine assumed the Americans could not possibly be there. That is the second strange thing about the story of Midway. Yamamoto had built his entire operational concept on the assumption that the enemy would react. He had planned a hunt. He had planned an ambush. He had positioned his forces to catch the American fleet as it steamed out from Hawaii, hurrying to save Midway. The trap was elegant. The trap was intricate. The trap depended on knowing where the enemy was, and would be, at every hour of the battle. But the enemy was already at the ambush point, waiting, watching, reading the transmissions. Nagumo did not know this. His scout patrols on the morning of the 4th of June were built for the wrong problem. He launched 7 scout aircraft to sweep the seas around his force. 7 planes for a search arc of 360 degrees at a maximum range of 250 miles. It was thin coverage. It assumed the enemy could not be close. It assumed there would be time to detect any threat and react. One of the 7 aircraft was Scout Number 4 from Tone. The one delayed 30 minutes by the jammed catapult. The one that would eventually find the American fleet, but only after a critical delay. If Tone's Number 4 had launched on time, at 4:30 in the morning, it would have found the American task force before Nagumo committed to his second strike on Midway. It would have been the first message on the bridge. It would have changed every subsequent decision. Instead, it launched at 5. For nearly 3 hours, Nagumo believed he was operating in an empty sea. He launched 108 aircraft against Midway at 4:30. He listened to the strike leader radio back that a second attack would be needed. He ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed. He watched as 93 planes on his 4 carriers had their torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs replaced with land attack ordnance. Fuel lines were laid across steel hangar decks. Ammunition handlers stacked the removed torpedoes on the hangar floor, waiting to strike them below into the magazines. It was going to take time. It could not be rushed. Somewhere above him, 3 American carriers were preparing to launch. Somewhere below him, sailors were arming cannons and carriers to become bombs. And on the horizon, a float plane finally lifted off from Tone at 5:10 in the morning, banked north, and began the search sector that would, 1 hour and 23 minutes later, produce the message that ended everything. The message that came at 7:28. The message that read 10 enemy surface ships. The message that would be followed, 8 minutes later, by the words that turned Nagumo's blood cold. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. He stood on the bridge and read it. He did not shout. He did not curse. He looked at the paper in his hand, and then he looked at his flight decks, at the 93 aircraft in the hangars below, at the torpedoes stacked on the deck plates because there had been no time to properly store them, and he understood, for the first time, that something was very wrong. The Americans were not supposed to be here, but they were, and somewhere on those American ships, another man was reading his morning intelligence brief. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, aboard Enterprise, 300 miles northeast of Midway, 55 years old, quiet, professional. He had never commanded a carrier task force in battle before. He was in command because his mentor, Admiral William Halsey, had been hospitalized with shingles just before the operation. Spruance had inherited 2 carriers and a mission he had not planned. He looked at the intelligence estimates. He looked at the position reports. He looked at the projected launch windows for the Japanese strike. And he calculated the moment when they would be most vulnerable. The Japanese carriers, according to every projection Nimitz's staff had provided, would have their reserve aircraft exposed on their flight decks between roughly 9 and 10:30 in the morning. Rearming, refueling, rotating aircraft between deck and hangar. That was the window. That was the moment when the Kido Butai would be a floating powder keg, unable to launch, unable to defend, unable to maneuver freely. Spruance would launch at that window, every aircraft he had. In one Doctrine Recomendike, sooner than Dane recommended, at greater risk than any commander of his generation would have chosen. But he had the intelligence, and the intelligence said the enemy would be exposed. He turned to his air operations officer. He said, "Launch everything." The first Japanese aircraft roared off Akagi's deck at 4:30 in the morning. It was still dark. The eastern horizon showed only the faintest gray line where the sea met the sky. 108 aircraft launched in less than 15 minutes from 4 carriers, forming up in the pre-dawn air, their exhaust stubs glowing blue in the darkness. They flew in tight formation toward Midway Atoll, 180 miles to the southeast. Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga led them. He was 29 years old, a torpedo bomber pilot with combat experience over China, and he had been given the honor of leading the strike because he was reliable, professional, and unlikely to make mistakes. He made no mistakes. The strike hit Midway at 6:30. The Marine defenders fought back with every anti-aircraft gun on the atoll. American fighters, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes, and a handful of Wildcats tried to intercept. They were shot to pieces. 15 American fighters were destroyed in the air. 7 more were damaged beyond repair on the ground. Japanese bombs cratered the runways, destroyed fuel storage, killed 20 defenders, wounded many more. But the American runways were not knocked out. They were damaged, cratered, difficult to use, but repairable, and the anti-aircraft fire had been ferocious. Tomonaga circled the atoll at 7 o'clock and made his professional assessment. He picked up his radio. He said, "There is need for a second attack." Those words traveled through the atmosphere at the speed of light, arrived at Akagi's radio room in less than a second, and were transcribed by a young petty officer who ran them up to the bridge. Nagumo read them at 7:15. He was a torpedo specialist. He understood, better than most, what a second strike required. It required aircraft. It required ordnance. It required time. He had aircraft, 93 of them, in the hangars of his 4 carriers, sitting on their trolleys with torpedoes bolted to their bellies, and armor-piercing bombs slung under their wings. Those weapons were designed for one purpose: killing warships, American carriers, specifically if any American carriers should appear, which the intelligence briefings had assured him they would not. He gave the order: rearm for land attack. In the hangar of Akagi, the ordnance handlers stopped what they were doing and stared at each other for a long moment. Then they got to work. They were disciplined men. They did not question orders. But the physical work of what had just been asked of them was enormous. 93 aircraft, across 4 ships, needed to be unbolted from their anti-ship weapons and rearmed with fragmentation bombs for use against ground targets. Each torpedo weighed almost a ton. Each armor-piercing bomb weighed 800 kilograms. They had to be lowered from the aircraft using specialized hoists, wheeled to the elevator, sent down to the magazines, and struck below into secure storage. Then the fragmentation bombs had to be brought up, wheeled to the aircraft, hoisted, and secured. It could not be rushed. And it was not rushed. It was, however, done incorrectly, because there was no time to strike the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs back down to the magazines properly. Instead, the ordnance handlers stacked them along the walls of the hangar, torpedoes on the deck plates, bombs beside them. Explosives out in the open, exposed, without the protective armored barriers that would normally separate them from any spark, any flame, any burning aviation fuel. The men doing the work knew this was wrong, but they were sailors, and their admiral had given an order, and the order came with a time constraint that made proper procedure impossible. So they compromised. They created, without meaning to, a floating powder magazine. At 7:28, the message from Tone's No. 4 scout plane arrived on the bridge. 10 enemy surface ships, course southeast. And his cautious mind registered something that felt slightly wrong. 10 ships was a substantial force. What were they doing here so early? He did not order any changes. He waited for confirmation. He needed more information. He got it at 8:20. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Now his cautious mind was no longer registering something slightly wrong. Now his mind was screaming that everything he had assumed for the last 3 months was incorrect. An American carrier. Here, northeast of Midway, in the position that Japanese doctrine said was impossible. He looked around the bridge. His staff officers were watching him, waiting for the decision. Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, 49 years old, chief of staff, careful thinker, spoke first. He said the reserve strike should be delayed. The rearming from anti-ship to land attack ordnance was already partially complete. To reverse it now, mid-process, would create chaos. Better to complete the current rearming cycle. Recover the Midway strike aircraft, which were even now returning and running low on fuel. Then, once the decks were clear, launch a single strike against the American carrier with proper weapons and proper coordination. Kusaka was proposing textbook doctrine. Never launch a divided strike against enemy carriers. Then, from Hiryu, 20 miles north of the main formation, a signal arrived. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, 49 years old, commander of Carrier Division 2, aggressive by temperament, was proposing the opposite course. He recommended launching immediately with whatever aircraft could be gotten airborne, in whatever configuration they carried. Attack now. Do not wait. Do not consolidate. Strike the American carrier before it can strike you. Yamaguchi was, in effect, telling Nagumo to abandon doctrine. Nagumo hesitated, and in that hesitation, one of the most consequential decisions in the history of naval warfare was made. He chose Kusaka's plan. He would complete the rearming. He would recover the Midway strike. He would launch a single coordinated attack with proper anti-ship weapons. It was the correct decision, according to every doctrine and every textbook in the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was also the decision that killed the Kido Butai. Because while Nagumo was choosing textbook doctrine, 3 American carriers, 150 miles to the northeast, launching 150 aircraft into the morning sky. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance had made his own decision at 7 o'clock in the morning, when Enterprise intercepted a PBY scout plane report placing the Japanese carriers within range. Spruance had immediately calculated the intercept geometry. The Japanese were closing on Midway from the northwest. His own force was northeast. If he launched immediately, at maximum range, his aircraft would arrive over the Japanese carriers at approximately 9:30 in the morning, at the exact moment when the Japanese would be most vulnerable, refueling and rearming their aircraft from the Midway strike. His staff advised against it. The range was extreme. Some aircraft would run out of fuel on the return leg. Some pilots would ditch in the ocean, some would drown. Spruance said, "Launch everything." His voice was quiet. He did not repeat himself. At 7 o'clock, Enterprise and Hornet began launching aircraft, 68 dive bombers, 29 torpedo bombers, and 20 fighters lifted off in an operation that took over an hour to complete. Yorktown, positioned about 10 miles to the north under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, launched her own strike an hour later, adding 35 more aircraft to the incoming wave. None of these aircraft flew as a single coordinated attack. They departed in separate squadrons, at different times, headed for different intercept points. The formation was, in the strict tactical sense, uncoordinated. It was ragged. It was almost amateur. It was also going to arrive from 3 directions at once. The first American aircraft to reach the Japanese fleet were the torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, 42 years old, half Sioux by birth, led 15 obsolete Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers toward the Japanese carriers at 9:20 in the morning. His aircraft were slow. They cruised at 110 knots. They flew low over the water to line up their torpedo runs. They had no fighter escort. Waldron had lost his Wildcats hours earlier in the confusion of the launch. He was going in alone. He knew what would happen. Before takeoff, he had told his men, in the ready room, that if only one of them survived to press home the attack, he wanted that man to remember that Waldron would have wanted him to press it home. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol saw them coming from 10 miles out. 0 fighters plummeted down from 10,000 feet, screaming through the American formation like sharks. Waldron's Devastators had no chance. They flew straight and level, low and slow, holding formation because that was the only way to line up a torpedo run. The Zeros came in from behind, from above, from the side. Waldron's aircraft caught fire and cartwheeled into the sea. His wingman went down 30 seconds later, then the next. All 15 aircraft were shot down, every torpedo missed. Not one American plane survived. One American pilot survived. His name was Ensign George Gay. He was 25 years old. His Devastator was hit multiple times, on fire, uncontrollable. He crashed into the sea, was thrown from the cockpit, and found himself floating in the water in a life vest with a seat cushion for cover. He hid under the cushion because Japanese ships were passing within a few hundred yards. He watched. For the next several hours, from the water, from beneath a floating cushion, George Gay watched the Battle of Midway happen directly above his head. 14 more Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6 on Enterprise arrived a few minutes later. 10 were shot down. 12 more from Torpedo Squadron 3 on Yorktown followed. 10 were shot down again. In total, 41 American torpedo bombers had attacked. 35 were destroyed. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese ship. On the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo watched the smoke plumes rising from the ocean where American aircraft had crashed. He saw his combat air patrol chasing the last Devastators across the wave tops. His face showed no expression. He had lost none of his own aircraft. 0 American attackers had scored. It looked, to a professional observer standing on the bridge that morning, like an overwhelming Japanese victory. It was not, because the Japanese fighter cover was now down at sea level, pulled low by the wave-top attacks of the torpedo bombers. The Zeros had run themselves ragged. Their ammunition was depleted. Their fuel was the sky above 10,000 feet, above Akagi, above Kaga, above Soryu was completely empty. While the torpedo squadrons were dying at wave-top height, Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky was 2 miles overhead, looking at his fuel gauge in a dauntless dive bomber over the empty Pacific, and making a decision that would change the world. McClusky was 40 years old, Air Group Commander of Enterprise. He had launched at approximately 7:45 in the morning with 33 dauntless dive bombers. He had flown to the intercept point calculated by his navigation officer. There were no Japanese carriers there. There was nothing there. Just empty water. His fuel was down to the point where turning back was the only sensible option. If he searched further and failed to find the enemy, none of his aircraft would make it home. 33 pilots and 33 gunners would ditch in the ocean and probably drown. That was the choice. Turn back now or hunt further and lose everything. McClusky flew on. He turned northwest. He gambled. He had 30 minutes of search time before absolute return became impossible. He used every minute, and at 9:55 in the morning, he saw something on the empty ocean below him. A single Japanese destroyer, running at high speed on a straight course. It was Arashi, returning to formation after having depth-charged an American submarine, the Nautilus, that had briefly threatened the Kido Butai. Arashi was rejoining her fleet at flank speed. Her wake was a long white arrow pointing directly at the Japanese carriers. McClusky followed the arrow. At 10:20 he saw them. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, arranged in a rough box formation, their flight decks visible, their combat air patrols still down at sea level, chasing the last torpedo bombers. McClusky called his squadron commanders. He gave the attack order. 33 dauntless dive bombers began climbing to their attack altitude. At almost the same moment, from a completely different direction, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie was leading 17 dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown's Bombing Squadron 3 toward the same target. Leslie was 39 years old, a professional aviator, a careful man. He had also, through a combination of good navigation and good luck, found the Japanese carriers. Neither American squadron knew the other was there. At approximately 10:22 in the morning, the Battle of Midway ceased to be about strategy and became about physics. McClusky's dive bombers pushed over first. They were assigned by procedure to attack the 2 nearest carriers, which happened to be Kaga and Akagi. But in the confusion of the initial dive, McClusky misidentified the targets, and most of his squadron committed to Kaga. Only one aircraft, in the last possible moment before commitment, recognized the mistake. Lieutenant Richard Best, 32 years old, commander of Bombing Squadron 6 on Enterprise, saw that Kaga was already being saturated with bombs from McClusky's aircraft. He had two wingmen. He signaled them, pulled his stick back, and broke away from the pack. He climbed briefly, banked, and rolled his three-plane section into a dive on Akagi. He was one man, 3 planes, 1,000-pound bombs each. Akagi's crew heard the sound first, a rising shriek that grew louder every second. Nagumo looked up. He saw them, 3 dark shapes falling almost vertically out of the sun. Anti-aircraft guns began firing. Too late, too late. Best's bomb hit Akagi at the amidships elevator. It penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, where 90-plus aircraft sat, some already fully fueled and armed for the attack on the American carriers that had never been launched, surrounded by torpedoes and bombs that had been stacked along the walls because there had been no time to strike them below. The hangar became a single expanding fireball. Aviation fuel ignited. Torpedoes detonated in sympathetic explosions. Armor-piercing bombs cooked off, hurling shrapnel through the ship's interior. Chain reactions rippled through the vessel. Damage control parties rushing toward the fires were incinerated where they stood. The bridge filled with acrid black smoke. Nagumo did not move. He stood at the front of the bridge, staring down at his burning flight deck, his hands at his sides. Kaga died even faster. 4 1,000-pound bombs from McClusky's aircraft struck her in rapid succession. One detonated near the island superstructure, killing everyone in the command center, including the captain. Another detonated among fully fueled aircraft on the flight deck. Burning aviation fuel poured through the ship like a liquid weapon. Crewmen leaped overboard from 3 decks up. The heat was so intense that paint peeled from escort destroyers 500 yards away. Soryu, meanwhile, was being attacked by Leslie's aircraft from Yorktown. 3 1,000-pound bombs struck her within 90 seconds. All 3 penetrated the flight deck and detonated in the hangar among rearmed aircraft. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto stood on his bridge as flames consumed his ship. He was 48 years old. He was ordered to evacuate. He refused. He would go down with Soryu. 6 minutes. That was how long it took. 6 minutes from the moment the first Dauntless pushed over into its dive. 3 fleet carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the most modern and powerful warships of their type in the world, were burning uncontrollably, their crews being incinerated or thrown into the sea. 1,500 sailors had died or were dying. 200 aircraft were destroyed on their decks, and the initiative in the Pacific War had shifted, in 6 minutes of gravity and physics and hot steel, from Tokyo to Washington. On the bridge of Akagi, Nagumo would not leave. He was in shock. Kusaka had to physically grab him by the shoulders, shouting into his face, telling him that the ship was lost, that command had to be transferred to a functioning vessel, that Nagumo had to abandon the bridge before the fires reached the ammunition below. Nagumo did not respond. Kusaka shook him hard. Nagumo blinked. They lowered him from the bridge using a rope, because every internal passageway was blocked by fire or wreckage. He slid down the outer hull to a waiting destroyer and was transported to the cruiser Nagara, where he re-established what was left of his command. He said almost nothing during the transfer. He looked back once at Akagi, at the black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the sky, and then he looked away. 20 miles to the north, on the bridge of Hiryu, Rear Admiral Yamaguchi watched the disaster through binoculars. He saw the smoke plumes rising from Akagi, from Kaga, from Soryu. He knew immediately what had happened. 3/4 of his strike force was gone in the time it took to eat lunch. He was now effectively the last operational carrier commander in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy east of the Marshall Islands. He did not hesitate. At 10:58 in the morning, Hiryu launched 18 Val dive bombers and 60 fighters against the American task force. The strike found Yorktown at noon. 3 bombs hit her flight deck. Fires erupted. 60 men were killed. Yorktown slowed, stopped, and began smoking heavily. Yamaguchi launched again in the early afternoon. 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zeros. They found Yorktown at 2:30, now underway and recovering aircraft, apparently repaired. The pilots believed they had found a second American carrier, a fresh target. They pressed home their attacks with courage and skill. 2 torpedoes ripped into Yorktown's port side. She listed 17 degrees. The captain ordered abandon ship. To the Japanese pilots returning to Hiryu, it looked like they had traded 3 of their carriers for 2 American carriers. A grim exchange, but not a catastrophic one. They were wrong. They had attacked the same ship twice. Yorktown had been damaged, temporarily patched, and put back into apparent service in the interval between the 2 Japanese strikes. There were still 2 American fleet carriers operating at full capacity, Enterprise and Hornet, and Enterprise had located Hiryu. At 5 in the afternoon, 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise appeared over Hiryu. They included several pilots who had, that same morning, put bombs into Akagi. Lieutenant Richard Best was among them. 4 1,000-pound bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession, following the same pattern that had killed her sisters. Fueled aircraft on the flight deck exploded. Fires spread through the hangars. By nightfall, Hiryu was a burning wreck, dead in the water, her captain and Admiral Yamaguchi still aboard. 300 miles to the west, on the battleship Yamato, Admiral Yamamoto was receiving fragmentary radio reports throughout the afternoon and evening. Radio discipline had collapsed. Messages arrived in bursts, incomplete, some contradictory. Akagi was on fire, Akagi was silent. Kaga was disabled. Soryu was gone. Then Hiryu was hit. Then Hiryu was silent. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matomi Ugaki, 52 years old, kept the operations diary. Later that evening, Ugaki wrote in his personal journal, in careful handwriting, the words that everyone on Yamato was thinking, but no one had yet said aloud. He wrote that the mood in the flag operations room was of men trying not to look at each other. He wrote that the silence was worse than any discussion. He wrote that Admiral Yamamoto sat in his chair for a long time, not moving, and that his face showed nothing. The night was coming, and on the sea, 4 carriers were burning. Night fell across the Central Pacific on June 4, 1942, and the sea burned in 4 places. Akagi, drifting powerless, her flight deck warped and cratered, her hangars still exploding intermittently as ammunition cooked off inside the wreckage. Kaga already going down, her hull red-hot in places, her survivors clinging to destroyers alongside her. Soryu listing heavily, her captain still refusing to leave his bridge. And Hiryu, 20 miles to the north, burning brightest of all because she had held out the longest. On the flag bridge of the battleship Yamato, 300 miles to the west, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in his chair and did not speak. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Matomi Ugaki, stood beside him with his hands clasped behind his back. The operations officers moved around them in silence, working the charts, plotting positions, computing distances. Every calculation produced the same answer. It was not a good answer. Yamamoto was 58 years old. He had spent his entire adult life in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had planned Pearl Harbor. He had planned the invasions of the Philippines, of Malaya, of the Dutch East Indies. He had planned this operation. He had planned the trap that had, in the space of 6 minutes, been sprung not by his forces but against them. He needed to salvage something. His senior staff officer, Captain Kamito Kuroshima, was a strange man. He was known throughout the fleet as a kind of eccentric genius. He worked in his cabin behind a locked door. He slept irregularly. He wrote his tactical plans in cramped handwriting on scraps of paper. And when he emerged from his cabin, he often had a proposal that would either save an operation or destroy it entirely. On the evening of June 4th, he emerged with a proposal. He said, "We still have the battleships." It was true. Yamamoto's main body contained the greatest concentration of surface firepower in the world. 7 battleships, including Yamato herself, her sister ship Nagato, and 5 older battleships. 9 cruisers, more than a dozen destroyers. Combined with the transport force and the covering group, Yamamoto controlled 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 45 destroyers scattered across the Central Pacific. If he could bring them together, if he could converge them on the American task force, if he could force the Americans into a night surface engagement where aircraft could not fly and where Japanese superiority in gunnery and torpedoes was overwhelming, then he could still salvage Midway. He could still kill the American carriers. He could still turn the greatest defeat in Japanese naval history into some kind of grim victory. Yamamoto gave the order at 8 o'clock in the evening. All forces would converge to the east at maximum speed. Every battleship, every cruiser, every destroyer within range. The transports carrying the 5,000 troops of the Midway invasion force were ordered to reverse course and join the convergence. The covering force coming up from the south was ordered to sprint north. Everything was to be aimed at a single point of interception in the darkness before dawn. It was a bold plan. It was in some ways the boldest plan of the entire operation, and it depended entirely on one assumption: that the American commander would not run. 300 miles to the east, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the flag bridge of Enterprise and reviewed the same geometry from the opposite side. He was 55 years old. He was a quiet man. He was not by disposition the kind of officer who took unnecessary risks. He had just won the greatest carrier victory in American history. He had sunk 4 Japanese fleet carriers, destroyed most of their air groups, and taken relatively light losses in exchange. He was ahead. He was ahead by more than he had any right to be. He knew what Yamamoto had. He had studied the intelligence briefings. He knew about the battleships. He knew about the cruisers. He knew that if he steamed west during the night, chasing the survivors of the Japanese carrier force, he would run directly into a wall of 16-inch guns and long-lance torpedoes. His carriers, without their air groups in the darkness, would be helpless. Yamato alone could sink Enterprise in 15 minutes with her main battery. Admiral Frank Fletcher, 57 years old, was technically the senior American commander at Midway. He was aboard Yorktown until she was hit, and after abandoning ship, he had transferred to the cruiser Astoria. From there, sometime in the late afternoon, he had radioed Spruance with a message that would decide the shape of the coming night. Fletcher acknowledged that he was no longer in a position to conduct effective air operations. He delegated tactical command to Spruance. He wrote that he would conform to Spruance's movements. Spruance now held the entire American fate in his hands. He read the message. He looked at the chart. He looked at his fuel state. He looked at the returning strike aircraft, the exhausted pilots, the empty ordnance bays. He looked at the dark line of ocean stretching west toward Yamamoto. He decided not to pursue. He turned his task force east. He would open the distance during the night. He would resume operations at dawn only if the situation demanded it. He would not, under any circumstances, allow his carriers to be caught in the darkness by Japanese battleships. The decision was, at the time, controversial. It would remain controversial for decades. Some of Spruance's own officers thought he was being too cautious. There was a Japanese fleet in retreat. There were surviving Japanese ships within reach. There was a chance to inflict even greater damage. Spruance walked away from that chance. He walked away because he understood what Yamamoto was trying to do. He was, without knowing it, saving the entire American Pacific Fleet. Yamamoto's convergence was coming together in the dark. The battleships were making 27 knots, throwing enormous bow waves, their crews at general quarters, their gun crews standing by the 16-inch turrets. 12 invasion transports were coming north to join the fight. The cruiser squadrons were racing east. Everything was aimed at a point where, at dawn, Yamamoto expected to find the American task force still within range. At midnight, the reconnaissance reports arrived. The Americans were withdrawing east. They were opening the distance. The convergence would never reach interception range before sunrise, and after sunrise, the Japanese fleet would be inside the American striking envelope, with no air cover, no protection, and no way to close the distance. Kuroshima laid out the geometry on the chart table. If Yamamoto pressed forward, he would spend the day of June 5th under attack by American dive bombers without the ability to strike back. His battleships would become targets for the same dauntless aircraft that had gutted his carriers. The greatest surface fleet in the world would be destroyed piecemeal in the open sea without ever getting close enough to fire her guns. Then, at 2 in the morning, a second message arrived from the fleet intelligence officer. It was a preliminary analysis of what had happened. It included the assessment that American radio traffic patterns before the battle had strongly suggested that the Americans had known the Japanese plan in advance. Not the general shape of it, the specific details, the target, the date, the composition of forces, the direction of approach. Ugaki read the report and did not speak. He wrote in his diary that night that a chill had passed through the operations room. It was worse than the loss of the carriers. It meant that everything they had done for the past 6 months, every operational message, every deployment, every plan, had been transparent to the enemy. Somewhere in the American intelligence apparatus, someone had been reading their mail. The realization was worse than the defeat, because the defeat could, in principle, be reversed. New carriers could be built, new pilots could be trained, new operations could be planned. But if the enemy could read Japanese naval codes, then no future operation could ever be secure. Every deployment would be watched, every attack would be anticipated, every trap could be counter-trapped. Yamamoto sat in his chair on the flag bridge and did not move for a long time. Just before 3 in the morning, he gave the order. The Midway operation was cancelled. All forces would withdraw westward. The invasion transports would return to Saipan. The battleships would break off pursuit. The cruisers would rejoin the retreating fleet. Everything would go home. For the first time since the war began, the Imperial Japanese Navy was in retreat. The withdrawal order created chaos across a fleet that had never practiced running away. 200 ships were scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean in the darkness, in multiple task groups, all of which now had to reverse course simultaneously, avoid collision, and extract themselves from enemy-controlled waters before dawn brought American air strikes. One of the units affected was Cruiser Division 7. 2 heavy cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma, had been part of the invasion covering force. They had been steaming east at high speed. Now they were ordered to reverse course and rejoin the withdrawal. In the darkness, with running lights extinguished and radio discipline partially collapsed, the 2 ships were maneuvering independently. At 2:15 in the morning, a lookout on Mogami saw a dark shape directly ahead. He shouted a warning. The helmsman threw the wheel over. It was not enough. Mogami's bow struck Mikuma's port quarter at nearly 28 knots. Both ships shuddered. Metal tore. Mogami's bow crumpled backward, folding almost 15 meters of the forward hull. Fuel tanks in Mikuma ruptured. Heavy oil began pouring into the sea. Both cruisers slowed to 12 knots, barely able to maintain steerage. Damage control parties worked through the night trying to seal the ruptured tanks. They could not. By dawn, the 2 crippled cruisers were trailing a dark ribbon of oil across the ocean surface. miles long, visible from the air. On the morning of June 5th, a PBY Catalina patrol plane from Midway spotted the oil slick. The report was radioed back to Midway. Marine Corps dive bombers took off, followed the slick, and found the two cruisers. The first attack damaged Mikuma further, but left Mogami still capable of movement. They pressed on, hoping to reach fighter cover from the Marshall Islands. They did not. On the afternoon of June 6th, dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet found them again. Mikuma took 5 direct hits. Fires consumed her from stern to bow. Her forward magazine detonated. She capsized and sank that evening, taking over 700 men down with her. Mogami absorbed 6 bomb hits and somehow remained afloat. She limped westward for weeks, was eventually towed home, and would spend the next year in dry dock being rebuilt. 2 more capital ships lost, not to a climactic battle, not to superior tactics, just to confusion and darkness and the impossibility of running an unrehearsed retreat with 200 ships in a fleet that had never learned how. Behind the fleeing fleet, the 4 carriers continued their death agonies. Akagi had burned through the night. Her crew had been evacuated to escort destroyers. At dawn on June 5th, with fires still raging and the ship listing dangerously, Yamamoto personally gave the order to scuttle. Destroyers moved into position. Torpedoes were launched into her hull. The flagship that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor rolled onto her side and sank at 5 in the morning. She had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Kaga had already gone down the previous evening. Her final hours had been catastrophic. Fires had spread to the main magazines. She had exploded from within, capsized, and sunk with over 800 men still trapped inside. Many of them had been sealed in engineering spaces by the damage control protocol. They had known they were being sacrificed to save the ship. They had gone down knowing that the ship they had died to save had died anyway. Soryu had sunk earlier still, in the late evening of June 4th. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto had refused to leave his bridge. His crew had begged him. His executive officer had begged him. He had ordered them all to abandon ship, and had then walked into his sea cabin and closed the door. When Soryu went down, Yanagimoto went down with her. Hiryu, Yamaguchi's flagship, had burned longest. She had been hit in the late afternoon of June 4th and had continued to burn through the night. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi and Captain Tomeo Kaku refused to be evacuated. They stood together on the burning bridge, drinking cold water from ceremonial cups, and told their crew to leave without them. Yamaguchi handed his black cap to a departing officer as a keepsake for his family. He said only that a commander who lost his ship should share her fate. In the early hours of June 5th, the destroyer Makigumo was ordered to scuttle Hiryu. She fired torpedoes into the burning hull. Yamaguchi and Kaku were still aboard. Hiryu sank at 9 o'clock in the morning, the last of the 4 to go down. 4 fleet carriers, 2,500 combat-ready aircraft crews, 3,057 Japanese sailors, 248 aircraft. All gone. In less than 48 hours, among the dead were more than 100 of Japan's most experienced carrier pilots. Men who had flown combat missions since China in 1937, men who could not be replaced, and a much larger number of trained deck crews, ordnance handlers, mechanics, and flight coordinators. The institutional knowledge of Japanese carrier aviation, vaporized in a single afternoon. America lost the carrier Yorktown. She had been abandoned on June 4th, then boarded again on June 5th by a salvage party. It looked, briefly, like she might be saved, but on the morning of June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168, under Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, 37 years old, had penetrated the American destroyer screen and put 2 torpedoes into her hull. The escorting destroyer Hammond was also hit and sank in less than 4 minutes. Yorktown floundered through the night. She rolled over and sank in the early morning of June 7th, taking with her 141 crewmen and 307 total American casualties from the battle as a whole. On paper, the exchange was lopsided in America's favor. 4 Japanese carriers for 1 American, 248 Japanese aircraft for 145 American. 3,000 Japanese dead for 300 American. It was a rout. The strategic reality was worse than the numbers. American shipyards were already launching Essex-class fleet carriers. 10 were under construction by the middle of 1942. More keels were being laid every month. American pilot training programs were producing new naval aviators at a rate that Japan could not match. The industrial base could absorb Midway's losses and reproduce them at scale. The Japanese naval yard at Kuri could build 1 fleet carrier every 18 months under optimal conditions, and the conditions were no longer optimal. Steel was scarce, aluminum was scarcer, aviation fuel was scarcer still. The window Yamamoto had described in 1941 when he had told the Tokyo government that Japan had 6 months, perhaps a year, to force a decisive settlement had not merely closed. It had shattered, and the shattering had happened on his watch, according to his plan, under his command. The survivors of the 4 carriers were ordered to silence. When they returned to Japan, they were kept aboard their ships in port. They were forbidden from speaking to their families. Some were transferred immediately to isolated garrisons in the South Pacific, to prevent them from ever returning home with the truth. Wounded men were kept in guarded hospital wards, isolated from other patients. The Imperial General Headquarters communique of June 10th described a great Japanese victory at Midway in which 2 American carriers had been sunk and 150 American aircraft destroyed. It did not mention Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, or Hiryu. It did not mention the 3,000 dead. Even the Prime Minister, General Hideki Tojo, was not told the full extent of the losses for weeks. The Emperor was informed privately in vague terms. The Japanese public heard only of a triumphant naval action. They believed throughout that summer that the war was still going as planned. But the men who had been there knew. Chuichi Nagumo, evacuated to the cruiser Nagara on June 4th, was quiet on the voyage home. He wrote his after-action report. It was competent, professional, and self-critical. He accepted responsibility for the tactical decisions that had led to the disaster. He was not court-martialed. He was not officially disgraced. He was, however, reassigned to shore commands and would never command a fleet carrier operation again. 2 years later, in the summer of 1944, he was in command of ground forces on Saipan when American Marines invaded. As the situation on Saipan collapsed, on the 6th of July 1944, Nagumo shot himself in his headquarters. His aide reported that his last words made reference to Midway. He said, "I should have died there." Minoru Genda recovered from his pneumonia. He continued serving in staff and command positions throughout the rest of the war. He believed, for the rest of his life, that if Nagumo had launched immediately when the scout plane report arrived, some Japanese strike might have reached the American carriers before Enterprise and Yorktown launched their dive bombers. He argued this in interviews for decades. After the war, he became a founding architect of Japan's post-war self-defense forces and served in the Japanese Diet until 1986. Mitsuo Fuchida survived his appendectomy and lived through the war. He converted to Christianity in 1950. He became an evangelist. He toured the United States speaking about forgiveness and reconciliation. He died in 1976. Yamamoto continued as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet. His aura of infallibility was gone. Everyone in the Navy knew that Midway had been his operation, his plan, his responsibility. He continued planning offensives, continued searching for the decisive battle that would salvage Japan's strategic position. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, he flew to inspect forward bases in the Solomon Islands. His itinerary was transmitted by radio to the base commanders. It was transmitted in a Japanese naval code that American cryptanalysts had, by that point, penetrated even more thoroughly than they had in 1942. 16 P-38 Lightning fighters were dispatched from Guadalcanal. They intercepted Yamamoto's flight over the jungle of Bougainville. His bomber was shot down. His body was recovered by Japanese search parties several days later. His death was announced in May. A national day of mourning was declared. Tokyo did not tell the Japanese public that Americans had read the message that killed him. The same code-breaking apparatus that had set the trap at Midway had killed the man who had planned Pearl Harbor. The intelligence war had eaten him, just as, 1 year earlier, it had eaten his fleet. In the basement office at Pearl Harbor, Joseph Rochefort continued working. He had won the greatest intelligence victory in the history of the United States Navy, and in the immediate aftermath, senior officers in Washington who had disagreed with his assessments about Midway moved against him. He was transferred out of Station Hypo in the fall of 1942. He was sent to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. His recommendation for the Distinguished Service Medal was blocked by the same officers he had proven wrong. He remained in that obscurity for the rest of his career. He retired from the Navy after the war and worked in private industry. He died in 1976 at the age of 76 in relative obscurity. 10 years after his death in 1986, the Distinguished Service Medal that had been denied to him was finally awarded posthumously by President Ronald Reagan. His family accepted the medal on his behalf. A decade later, in 1996, President Bill Clinton awarded him the National Security Medal, also posthumously. His grave at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego was quietly updated to reflect the honors. He was the man who had won Midway. And it took the country 44 years to admit it. The wreck of Yorktown was located in 1998, sitting upright on the Pacific floor at a depth of 16,500 feet. Kaga's shattered hull was found in 2019. Akagi was discovered the same year. The wrecks of Soryu and Hiryu remain unlocated, somewhere in the vast, dark reaches of the Central Pacific. But the lesson of Midway does not lie 2 miles down. It lies on the surface, in the pages of every history of the war, in the memories of every man who fought there. Midway was not lost in 6 minutes of dive bombing. It was lost in 6 months of overconfidence, in intelligence that was dismissed because it seemed too good, in assumptions that the enemy was crippled, confused, predictable, in doctrine applied at the moment when doctrine should have been abandoned, in a scout plane launched 30 minutes late, and in a code that had been read for months, and in the belief, held by admirals who should have known better, that their trap could not itself be trapped. The trap that Chuichi Nagumo realized he had sailed into on the morning of June 4, 1942, was not set by American dive bombers. It was set by the certainty, held for 6 months at every level of the Imperial Japanese Navy, that such a trap could not exist. He died believing he should have died there. He was not wrong. He had simply arrived at the truth too late.